Welcome to our third video in our AZ-800 series. Today we're going to be talking about the two exam objectives for configuring and managing AD sites and AD replication. I'm going to start out like always, going over some of the concepts on the whiteboard, talking about what sites are and some replication things to know about them. I have a lab environment ready for you in the repo. I'm going to spin up that lab environment and we will configure everything so you can see firsthand what it looks like to get this going. Let's cut over the whiteboard and let's go over what sites and replication are. All right, let's start by talking about Active Directory sites first. Now, let's say this is a representation of your business and your current DC architecture right now. You have your on-prem data center with one DC, you've got your Azure environment with another DC, and let's just say for the sake of our scenario here that you have a VPN link between those, but it is not that robust. So traffic between on-prem and Azure isn't that great. Now, you've got a challenge, and your challenge is you have a whole bunch of on-prem users that have their own workstations, and you don't want them talking to your Azure DC. But by default, with Active Directory, the second a workstation comes online, it looks up your domain returns a domain controller randomly, and that is the domain controller your workstation uses to handle its authentication traffic, group policy processing, any other AD operations. So if you have this setup and you have a low speed VPN connection between the two, how would you prevent your on-premise workstations, your 200 clients or whatever, from sending traffic to your Azure DC and filling up your VPN pipe? Or you just don't want to use that bandwidth for that traffic at all. How do you isolate it? The answer is Active Directory sites. Now, this is really simple. I've got the DC names and IP addresses populated here. Site objects are just containers that you use to associate your servers and your networks. So you would create two Active Directory sites in this use case. You have one for on-prem, and like I said, it's a container, so I'm representing this with a box. And you have a second site for Azure. All you have to do to configure sites and localize the traffic is create the site and associate your network objects. In this case, I've got 10.0.10/24, and I have 10.0.20/24. I create these in Active Directory. I associate my on-prem site with my on-prem network and my on-prem DC. And I create a second site for Azure, and I associate my Azure DC with my Azure network. And now I have localized any traffic that is originating from 10.0.10/24 is automatically going to hit this site and use DC1. And any traffic that's coming from 10.0.20, which is my theoretical Azure network, is going to use the Azure DC and hit that traffic. When it comes down to Active Directory sites, this is really it. It's not complicated. Now, this is just the first part. Like I said, this video is about Active Directory sites and replication. And anytime you're talking about defining sites, the other piece of this is you are controlling then the second piece, which is replication between the two of these. There are some nuances when you're talking about replication. I'm going to go ahead and show you in a lab environment how we create sites first and how we configure them. And we'll get back to the replication settings later because it's a little bit more in the weeds, a little more to think about there. So let's cut over to our lab and let's set up just our two sites here to show you what that looks like. All right, we are at our lab environment here. And if you're using the guided lab that I provide with you or for you with the repo, I just want to note it's going to spin up the first domain controller, create your domain. But the other two servers that it creates, you're going to have to go through and promote those two domain controllers before you can do this work. Because anytime you're working with sites replication, you do need multiple domain controllers. So I've already done that, at least for our second DC. Let's go ahead and start looking at what it looks like to configure an Active Directory site. It's pretty straightforward. Even the console makes sense. You open your admin tools, and right here you have a console called Active Directory Sites and Services. Makes sense, right? If I open this up, by default, sites are denoted by this little blue icon here. And by default, you have a site called default first site name. This is with any Active Directory domain that's out of the box. First thing let's do, let's rename this site, because I'll show you that's pretty trivial. You can do that and it's not going to affect anything. And to go off of our example here from the board, I'm going to name this on-prem. And we're going to need to create a second site for our Azure environment, because those are the two sites that we're defining here. So I'll right click on sites and click new site, and we will call this Azure. Now, when you're creating a site, this is the only thing that you really have to choose. We're not going to talk about this for now, because this goes back to replication, which we'll get to in a second. So for now, I'm just going to create the site, hit OK. And now the thing that I have to do is associate the server with the site, because there's three components to a site. You have the site itself, you have the DCs or the servers associated with it, and you have the network range associated with it. So to move a server to the site, I can either right click and move this, or I can just click and drag. You can just ignore that warning, hit OK. And now I have my two sites, just like example. I've got on-prem with DC1, I have Azure with DC2, and the last thing we have to do is associate the network ranges with them. Now, there's a little bit of nuance here that you need to understand. I have, under this console, a subnets section that I can use to define network. By default, there's nothing in here. If you don't define any networks, then traffic can go anywhere. Even here, the way I have this set up, where I have an on-prem and Azure site with servers separated, traffic can go anywhere, because there's nothing designating that clients from this IP space have to go to this site. So to define a subnet, all I have to do is right click, go to new subnet, and I always prefer to use CIDR notation, which is what's recommended here. I'm going to add two subnets. I'm going to add the 10.0.10 and 10.0.20 that correspond with my sites here. So 10.0.10/24, and I'm going to select that to be associated with the on-prem site. That's right here. Hit OK. And I'm going to go back here and do the same thing again. 10.0.20. Put an extra dot in there. /24, and I'm going to associate that with Azure and hit OK. And now, if I click on just the subnets folder here, I can see I've got two subnets defined, 10.0.10, 10.0.20, and those are both going to their respective sites. Now, there's a couple of questions you might have looking at this console. If I'm a business and I add another network, like maybe I'm segmenting my server traffic onto its own subnet on-prem, what happens if my network's not defined here? Well, that then defaults back to the default behavior, where it will just query AD, it will return any server from any site, and you'll talk to that server. So if I have a client here that's coming from 10.0.30/24, that will not go to any one site. It will just kind of go wherever it wants. That DC traffic is undefined. There is something to note for that, though. There is a log on every domain controller called netlogon.log. That's going to be under, if I open my file explorer, it'll be C Windows debug. And right here, I have that log file I was talking about. Now, there's nothing in here. And that's normal. This netlogon.log file is where log entries will start showing up if you have clients that are hitting your DCs from a subnet that is not defined here. I'm going to try and generate traffic for this log, but when I did this in a previous lab, I couldn't actually get it to populate. Either way, I have a third server on a 10.0.3 subnet. I'm going to try and generate logs, and I'll come back in a second, and if I can't get them, then I'll just kind of show you what they look like. So, okay, I got it. I went ahead and signed into my DC3 here that I've got, which is on 10.0.3. And if I go back to this log file, I don't know if I can zoom in. I can. You see right here, this is exactly the log line that gets generated by any client who's hitting your DCs from a subnet that's not defined in sites and services. So if you are managing Active Directory sites and services and you are defining your subnets, which you kind of have to do, it's the whole point of having a site, you need to be monitoring this log, collecting it from each domain controller, and adding any subnets that aren't listed here. Otherwise, If you're having traffic and the log entry showing up and you actually don't know what that subnet is, it means you need to go research and figure out how is that client even talking to your domain controller to begin with. But for the sake of illustration, we see I have a 10.0.3 subnet that's not defined. So let's go back here and add it. Now, I could do exactly what I did for the other networks. I could right click and go to new subnet, and I can do 10.0.30/24, and this would work. Or the other option that also works is you have the ability to layer different ranges, IP ranges or subnets on top of each other to kind of designate different structures. What that looks like is if I were to do 10.0.0.0, instead of doing a /24, I could do a /22, and that gives me 10.0.0 through 10.0.3, which would cover all these different subnets. So if I do this and associate this with on-prem, now what I have is I have one broad /22 network that automatically goes to on-prem, meaning this is where I want any traffic that's not really more specifically defined. I want to go to my on-prem site. And then I have my 10.0.20.24 network. This subnet is actually inside this range. This is actually going to Azure. So what this is saying is if you're 10.0.2, go to Azure. If you're part of the broader just whole network, go to on-prem. This is how we actually have this defined on my company. I have one large site, and all of our network space is designated, I think, like on a /16. So massive network space is all defined and all point to that default main site. And then we have smaller subnets mapped out that go to individual sites, like for our Azure, for some of our server traffic, specifically for the data center. What you're doing here is you are directing traffic to whatever DC is closest, and that will also scope it so that you don't have traffic going out. Now, the other thing that you get out of doing this, or the other question you might have, is if one of my sites is down, like here I have one server in Azure. What happens if this one server is down, but I have traffic coming from this 10.0.2 Azure subnet? Active Directory is smart enough to know if none of your domain controllers in a site are available, it will send that traffic somewhere else. So it is important to make sure your sites are always online and available if you have this set up this way, but Active Directory is resilient enough where if nothing is available locally that you have defined here, it will go to the broader domain and find domain controllers that it can use out there. So let's ask the question, when do we want to define this and when don't we? This does add a layer of complexity, and we're gonna get into that when we start talking about replication, especially. So it's not that you want to like define every single physical building in your whole company, whether or not that maps to a domain controller. There's also an argument to be made if you have a lot of different domain controllers across the country, you may not want to isolate authentication traffic to each individual domain controllers, especially if the data centers that have your domain controllers don't directly correlate with offices where your workers are. You might want to have some geographically scoped areas, like East Coast goes to one, West Coast goes to other, but there isn't a giant need to define these, especially because authentication traffic on modern internet and VPN and web speeds isn't really that much. So you're not losing that much, you're more gaining the latency of that request bouncing across the country if it has to. So I will say it's not that you want to define everything, but the sort of things you do want to define where you get an advantage from using and defining sites is if you have cloud environments like Azure, you are paying in Azure for data egress, meaning traffic leaving Azure. If you have a whole bunch of servers and workloads you're running in Azure that are using your domain and hitting those domain controllers, it doesn't make sense to pay for that egress traffic or to soak up the bandwidth from any express route or VPN connection to send that traffic back on-prem. That is a perfect use case for defining when you'd want to use a site, because it will keep all of that authentication traffic within your virtual networks in Azure without having to send it back out of Azure to go hit your local domain controllers and come back. That is exactly the situation where this makes a lot of sense. But it's more of an art than a science. You kind of have to figure how much do you want to scope traffic and how much you don't. And some of that decision will be influenced by how complicated some of the replication settings get to be, because there is a little bit of math there. With that being said, let's cut back over to the whiteboard really quick and look at what exactly are those replication settings that you need to take into consideration, because there are definitely some nuance there in figuring out what that looks like. So, okay, when we are talking about replication from an AD sites and services perspective, we are actually discussing the relationship between two sites. Microsoft calls this relationship an IP site link. This is what we saw in the menu when we were configuring the sites. We chose just the default IP site link. In this case, when we get to the lab, we're going to make a couple more of these so you understand this better. Now, there are 3 settings associated with an IP site link that control how this relationship works. The first 2 are going to be an interval and a schedule. Forgive me if my handwriting is terrible. There, interval and schedule. Now, an interval is simple. That's going to be the delay between, or how the frequency of how often data is copied between sites. So if I create a user in my on-prem site, the interval is how long it takes for that user to be copied to my DCs in Azure. By default, the interval is 180 minutes. That's 3 hours of time. So not really usable if you're just talking about a cloud environment that should be a pretty close representation of on-prem. I believe the lowest you can set this interval is to 15 minutes, but there's a way around that. So we will get to that in the lab environment, and I will show you how to work with that. The other setting, the second setting, is schedule. And this is exactly what it sounds like. This is, you can dictate when exactly replication is allowed to occur between two sites. The third setting that we're going to talk about is called cost. It's kind of difficult to illustrate cost with just 2 sites. So for the sake of illustration, let me erase some of this, and we're going to break this out into 3 sites so I can illustrate this a little bit better. We have our on-prem site with DC1, we have our Azure site with DC2, and we're going to add a 3rd site. We're going to call this EU for Europe, just kind of going off of our previous examples. Europe is going to have DC3, and it is going to have our 10.03 network that we saw earlier in the video. Now, we are concerned about cost. This is what we're learning. Cost doesn't really get taken into account until you have multiple, or at least 3 sites with multiple IP site links in place. Now, we have to define this relationship, right? This is our IP site link that's in place. When I create this, I could, if I wanted to, create only a relationship between our on-prem data center and our European office. What this means is, if a user was created or updated in Azure, that change would get replicated to on-prem, and then after our interval, our delay, that change would then get replicated to EU. So it'd have to go through 2 hops. That works, but I can also define a relationship this way. So let's say EU has connections to Azure, it has connections to on-prem, so everything is kind of talking to each other. This is where cost comes into play. Cost is a numeric representation of basically the speed of your internet connection between sites. So let's say you have a high-powered VPN appliance in on-prem, or you even have an express route to Azure. That's going to have a very low cost because it's a really high speed. So we're going to say our cost for this connection is 100. Now, let's say your equipment in EU is not really that great. So you've got a lower speed, but you've got a relatively high speed connection back to your main office, not so much to Azure. So let's say our cost for this is going to be 200. It's slower than this site, but it's not that bad. And let's say our cost to get to Azure, maybe we're routing all the way back to Azure US East from Europe, so it's terrible. Let's say this cost is going to be 500. So 100, 200, 500. if this is how you have cost configured, if I were to create and update a user in Azure, it would still not use this IP site link because the cost for this site to get directly from Azure to Europe is 500 total. And this is how Microsoft's calculated the math. However, it calculates the math from Azure to on-prem to EU. The cost for that is 100 plus 200. It's 300 route for this. Meaning replication is going to occur from Azure to on-prem to EU for everything instead of using this 500 cost link. The only time it will use this is if one of these other links goes down or is unavailable, and now it's okay to use this as a fallback. This is what I was talking about when I said some of the replication settings get complicated and you really have to think through them. I will say, and I've said this multiple times in the video, most of this sort of math and this thinking and this planning you have to do around replication doesn't really apply much today because internet speeds are really, really fast. Replication traffic is pretty minor. Authentication traffic is pretty minor. You don't normally have to think about this, but I'm showing this because for the exam you need to know it, and you never know when you're going to have to come across setting up some satellite office somewhere, and this actually might apply once in a while. So these are the settings. We're going to show you how to configure this. We're going to cut back over to the lab. The other setting that I'm going to tell you how to configure is the interval. Like I said, default 3 hours, minimum setting is 15 minutes. There's also a way to trick this and force it so that replication is instant. I'll show you how to do that in the lab as well. So that's our numbers. Let's go ahead and cut back to our lab environment where we already have our 2 sites. We'll add our third and we'll look at what these settings look like in real-time first-person configuration. I am back in the same lab environment we had earlier. The one change I've made is I connected to DC3 and I promoted that server to a domain controller. So now it shows up here in our sites and services menu. And you'll see it's listed here under on-prem because this is our default site. So let's go ahead and add our third site, just like we did the other 2. Add new site. We'll call this EU. And we're going to choose this default IP site link for now, and we will go and define this later. We'll modify this in a second. So add the site, drag the server over, and now I have my 3 sites on-prem, Azure and EU, and DC1, DC2, DC3. So let's look at our IP site links. By default, this is the one that's available. You see right here, it's got our cost and replication interval defined. If I open this, you see it also down here. I'm pointing these settings out as a reminder because if you're taking the exam, Microsoft loves to ask you graphical interface questions as in, where do you go to set these properties? The properties is under inter-site transports, IP, and then your links objects themselves. You right click, go to properties, and here are your cost and replication. And the one setting that's also there is change schedule. And here you can say, select your days and say, I don't want to replicate on Saturday or Sunday. And now my replication schedule is Monday through Friday. So this is how you set the schedule object. I've never actually set this in production. It just kind of seems a little crazy to me. You can set this, but I'm going to hit cancel. The settings that are more important to an administrator day to day are the cost and replication interval. Before I change these, let's create actually 3 site links to represent the 3 different relationships between sites. So I'm going to go ahead and hit new site link. We're going to call this on-prem Azure. And we will add those 2 sites. Hit OK. Do another site link, and this will be on-prem EU. Add those. And new site link, EU to Azure. There. I should now be able to delete this site link because it's redundant compared to the other sites. So hit yes, delete. Now, you can have multiple IP site links that are conflicting with each other. So if you're trying to track schedules, make sure that you're clearing up those site links between sites that might be conflicting or overriding existing information. Otherwise, you're going to have to manage multiple settings. But let's go ahead and set this replication up exactly the same way we had cost-wise over here. So our cost between on-prem and Azure was 100. This is good. Now, I want this to replicate quickly. So I set my replication to 1 minute. It yells at me saying, your fastest replication you can be is 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and set 15 minutes as a replication for everything, because there's not really much. I never want a 3-hour delay. That just seems crazy. This is going to be 100 with a 15-minute interval. My on-prem to EU site, I will actually leave this, let's say at 2 hours, because it's going to take people a while to fly between. It doesn't really matter. But our cost is going to be 200 because our connection between on-prem and EU is going to be a little bit slower. So hit apply, hit OK. Finally, our EU and Azure site, this is the one that's really slow. It's for whatever reason, let's say EU has a hard time getting to Azure. Our cost is going to be 500. And our replication is also going to be 120 minutes. Hit apply, hit OK. And now we have this configured exactly the same way we had this configured on our whiteboard over here. If something's replicating from Azure to EU, the path, you would think it would use this site, but because the cost is so great, it's actually more efficient for it to go from Azure to on-prem at 100, and then from on-prem to EU at 200 for a cost of 300, versus going direct from EU to Azure. You can monkey with these all you want. If all costs are the same, then it doesn't really make sense to even maintain separate site links for everything. If I want the cost of everything to be 100, then let's just go back to rename this to default. I'll leave the cost at 100. I'll delete these other two. I'll add my other site. I'll delete this one. And now I have one site. Any member of this site, the cost to get anywhere is 100. The replication interval is 15. And this is a nice, simple, I'm maintaining one replication schedule for everything. And it's nice and clean. And there we go. This is my preferred way of doing it, just because it's less administrative overhead and it's easier to kind of wrap your head around what exactly the settings are. Unless you have a specific reason to be adjusting all of these settings on a case-by-case basis between sites, you don't need to. Now, let's talk about our replication interval. The setting we're looking for is actually called change notification. And what it's actually doing is, rather than setting replication to being instant, like a 1 minute or 0 delay, it is setting the site so that if any change occurs, it notifies other members of the site link and tells them a change occurred, and then they go and replicate the change immediately. So it becomes more of like an instant replication mechanism, more the default way. The way we set the setting is not available in sites and services. It is a little obscure, but it's good to know. So in order to get to that setting, we actually have to go to a console called ADSI edit. And I think I have to do .msc. There you go. Now, ADSI edit is something that I think every administrator forever has always been warning people. If you're learning this, you don't want to be in here very much editing things, or you can break your domain pretty quickly. But what you're doing is you want to connect to the configuration context. This is literally giving you direct access to the Active Directory database to read properties or settings or attributes that aren't available in other places. I'm going to connect to my domain and the configuration context and hit OK. And what we're going to see here is a whole bunch of extra configuration. It's your hidden configuration container of Active Directory that contains a bunch of settings. We're going to go to Sites here, and under Intersite Transports, you'll see that this actually represents the different containers that we see in our sites console. But we'll go to Intersites Transport, and I want to expand IP, and what we're going to do is actually modify the properties of this site link object. And you'll notice this is our default site link. So this corresponds with the site link we have in the console that we just created. I'm going to right click on this and go to Properties. And we scroll down, and it is not a property that there's a checkbox for. This is kind of a little bit more obscure. We're going to look for this options attribute. We're going to open this, and we're going to set this value to 1 and hit OK and apply. And what you'll see here is the attribute is now 1, and it says in parentheses, use notify. What this means is if a change occurs to a site that's a member of this site link, notify the other members that there's a change and instantly replicate. This is how we configure instant replication on an Active Directory site so that we don't have to wait the 15-minute interval delay. Obviously, this is a lot more complicated, it's a lot more obscure to get to, and it's not visible at all from this console that you've set this. So make sure that if you're setting this, 1, it's what you want to do because it's difficult to change, and 2, that somewhere in your documentation for your organization, you have noted that this is set this way so that replication is instantaneous. I don't think this is on the exam. I'm fairly certain that this is just kind of one of those institutional knowledge things that you should know how to do, because I guarantee if you start working with sites, somebody, probably someone from your IAM team who's doing scripting, is going to wonder, hey, I just updated this user. Why can they not log in? Or why is this property not showing? And usually it's because of replication delay, and it's because of this interval right here. So it's good to know that you have the option to set this to instant if you want. It does consume more bandwidth, more traffic. So if that is a concern, you want to make sure you set it on whatever site link you want that to occur. You also have the ability to set it in what's called NTDS settings. I'm going to talk about this next because this is other thing you're going to know. But generally, my rule of thumb is don't modify these NTDS settings. So let's recap what we've got so far. We talked about what it looks like to create a site. We talked about how a site is just a container that represents a physical location that you can use to define authentication boundaries. The site is then associated with a subnet that says anything in this subnet talks to this site. And then you have your domain controllers defined for each site. So a site is a container associated with your domain controllers and your network space for that site. And then we start talking about replication. Replication is your relationship between sites. So site 1 to site 2, site 2 to site 3, and the settings associated with those sites, which are your cost, how fast does traffic move between those sites, your replication, how frequently does replication occur between those sites, and your schedule, which is when is replication allowed to occur. That gets us to where we are today, or right now. The last tool, or the last bit that I want to cover when talking about replication, is going to be how you actually analyze replication from server to server. How do you know when replication is occurring and the state of it? This is really good tools for you to know. There are a couple of command line utilities that you can use to analyze with replications occurring. Give me a second, I'm just gonna make the font bigger so it's easier to see here. The first tool that you will want to know as an Active Directory administrator, I've used this a bunch of times myself, is Repadmin. Now, if you just type it in, you will see this Repadmin command has a bunch of sub-utilities that you can then use as tools to troubleshoot or to work with replication. The first one I'll show you is REPL Summary. This is the one that I go to almost all the time if I have a replication issue. What this will show you is your replication partners between domain controllers and the delay that's occurred between how long that information is replicated. You will see here, every DC relationship is represented by 5 attempts. So this interval is how many partners this has. This is telling me DC1 has 2 partners and it has failed 0 out of 10 times to replicate those partners. Meaning, if you see zeros in this column, this fails column, it means your replication is totally healthy, there's no issues. The one thing this doesn't do a good job of showing you is what those partners actually are. So I know I can infer from the fact that there's 10 tries here that the source, DC1, is trying to replicate to both of my DC2 and DC3. To show you what that looks like in the console, if I go into this server and the NTDS settings, this is showing the replication partners of DC1. Now it's saying it's replicating from DC2 and from DC3. So that is replicating from those servers to this one, and this one is going to DC2 and it's going to apparently this has no replication partners. This should show from DC1 as well, because that's what's being applied here. But you, as an administrator, do not want to mess with these NTDS settings at all if you can avoid it. If things get really complicated and it messes with some of the brains of Active Directory and replication, and you don't need to. Microsoft has made a whole business out of being able to do this replication really well themselves without needing the manual intervention. So I will say, don't mess with NTDS settings. If you do, it might break something, and you're better off letting Microsoft do it themselves. The way that Microsoft controls and configures replication is using what's called the KCC, or the Knowledge Consistency Checker. This is used to recalculate the replication topology, meaning the KCC is determining, okay, this server makes sense to replicate from this server, and this server makes sense to replicate from this server, and it manages all those relationships for you, and it automatically creates these NTDS settings objects. So this command right here, if you look, it says forces the KCC to immediately recalculate its inbound replication topology. So if I do repadmin /KCC, it will say it's running against the domain controller that we're connected to, and it went ahead and went through each site and recalculated those relationships. And I don't know if it will show up here. It didn't. Whatever. It's not too big of a deal. But you'll notice right there, the NTDS settings for this domain controller did change. So it did some calculation, determined its best partner, and then updated the NTDS settings for you. I'm pretty sure if you were to delete this, it would also go ahead and recreate them. But there's not too much more to know here, other than the other thing I was going to show you was this show repl command. This is the other one that I actually use for troubleshooting replication. And all this is doing is showing the different schema objects. You'll notice if when we were in ADSI edit, we were on the configuration context. These are like core configuration containers of your domain. And this command, show replication, goes through and checks each one of these core configuration or containers and validates that the replication is good and been successful across your domain everywhere. When I've troubleshooted replication issues in the past, I actually haven't had to do much when it comes to actually configuring the replication themselves. For the most part, the KCC does a fantastic job of managing it. I don't actually have to tweak anything, and I shouldn't need to. Most of the time, what I'm troubleshooting is network connectivity good? Are my site links defined? Does DNS work across everything? And those three things, if they're working well, replication usually will take care of itself. But I'll put the caveat on there. Replication can take a long time. You'll notice when we ran this summary command, the deltas between replication is an hour on here. And that directly has to do with the delay from your site links. So sometimes if you're troubleshooting this, you might fix a DNS issue. It's going to take a long time to reflect successfully on this repadmin command that has occurred. So usually if you're troubleshooting replication, expect that it's going to be a multiple days event where you're just kind of monitoring it and checking in and seeing if it's fixing itself. And you should hopefully see that these numbers resolve. And if they don't, go back and tweak something else, continue to troubleshoot and come back. But this is a tool for monitoring. And really it's just an indicator of probably other issues somewhere in your environment, usually with network connectivity, that's affecting this. I'm calling this out so that because you should know some of these replication tools and this repadmin command for troubleshooting. There are graphical interface tools available where you can get this to print out in more of a GUI friendly thing. You have to download and run those. But I like to show this just to show mostly so you get an idea of what this KCC looks like, which is the part that manages these individual domain controller connections for you. And like I said, you don't really want to mess with it. I'm going to go ahead and wrap here. Replication and sites is not really that complicated of a topic. It is the sort of thing that you configure once and then you don't really mess with it too much. Usually most of the administrative overhead or effort goes back to just maintaining subnets, monitoring that net logon file, adding subnets for clients that might be missing, and maybe modifying your site links if you decide you want to change some of the replication delay there. But that's it. If you have any questions about the content, feel free to post them on this video. Otherwise, I do have the lab environment that I used here ready to go. The deployment is configured and set up in Terraform from my repo. If you're not using that AZ-800 repo, I would heavily recommend it. I will also be putting up quiz questions for you to test yourself, along with lab scenarios for you to work through yourself. Now, as a reminder, if you have not watched the intro video, go back and watch that quickly. I leave instructions for you on the best way to use the lab environment in the quiz. You should be quizzing yourself. You should be using lab environment, testing yourself. It will make you more successful when it comes time to take the exam. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next week with our next video, whatever that topic is.